Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it correct from that historical perspective. And today I am delighted to have a new friend, Christy, is going to be on with us, and an old friend, George, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves formally here in a moment. But we're going to dig into that really that unique idea of sustainability, uh, global everything. I'm telling you, folks, this is the time to sit down and with George and Christy, we're going to talk about some realities. Now, I've known George for, I was putting it up on the calendar, George. We've known one another about 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
every bit of it. Yes.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
with that introduction of our aging, and he has more gray hair than I do, but my mustache shows it all. With that, George, why don't you give a formal introduction of yourself and Christy, and tell us about this thing called a tree hugging capitalist? Give me a little brief on that, will you please?
Great. So thanks, Tom. And yeah, it's been my pleasure to know you for 20 years, inside and out. I I root everything based on my upbringing and especially my experience with the Boy Scouts. And the Boy Scout training that I had was probably the best that I could utilize going forward, especially in sustainability. Our mantra with the Scouts was leave no trace. And that applied to not only our campsites, but everything we did. So, restoring the earth to or a campsite to a better place than we found it, recycling, reutilizing, everything had its place. And we were truly stewards of the environment and of the geography. And I've taken that forward into all my businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I was in telecom, we were always looking at ways of reducing our energy intensity,
Mm-hmm.
our carbon footprint, especially as things moved into the internet. We were doing server clusters and consolidating instruments and utilities, etc. And then we went into a sustainability platform to help companies understand their carbon footprint, their energy intensity, their utilization of all resources, natural, human, and financial. And that led us into a consulting business that we developed software, and we partnered up with teams from MIT and Harvard, where we were utilizing the equivalent of a gallon of gasoline to have for the lack of a better term, a currency of carbon and energy. And that was called the Energy Point. And as successful and as beautiful as the platform was, nobody was buying it.
Right.
So
I remember that well.
yeah. So when we brought it to market and whatnot, everybody loved it, but nobody bought it. And you found out that greenwashing starts at the top of all these corporations and comes down, and it's more about virtual signaling and ideology and who your audience is, and trying to pull in a broader audience into the stakeholder versus shareholder game.
Right.
So what Christy and I have developed, and I had developed this a few years ago and then brought Christy in, is the tree hugging capitalist.
Mm-hmm.
Do I believe in tree hugging? Absolutely. Trees are our friends. Carbon dioxide is our friend. The trees are the perfect environmental filter and production machination for everything we need to food and water, etc. And we wanted to take a look at it from not only a personal point of view, but from a business point of view. How does this make sense by protecting our resources and really understanding them and fighting the ideologists that have been around since the first Earth Day, right through the present time with their dire predictions and and all their henny penny, the sky is falling.
And I got to say, George, interrupt on that one. And now what we saw this last Earth Day is the human candle on the Supreme Court steps. That's how crazy the ideology has gotten. And,
well, I mean, they've been chaining themselves to bridges, to fences.
Right.
They've been gluing themselves to floors, and and we've seen it over the years where they were blocking trains and trucks and loggers, and they were actually even booby trapping trees with steel spikes to create harm to the loggers, who their job is just to take down trees. They're not trying to destroy the earth.
So let me ask you, just with that real quick too, is that so you found Christy by and Christy, you don't have any gray hair, so as being part of this conversation, you're unique. So if I may, George, what's Christy tie into this?
Well, I'm getting to that.
But, okay. I'm impatient. You know how I am.
Well, being Irish, there's always a longer path to the destination. So.
Yeah, well, being an old Polak, you know how that works on my side.
Yeah, well, Christy's German, so
there we go.
She's right in between the two of us, literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
So, so what I've been trying to accomplish over the last few years, and I've had a few proteges, but the timing never seemed to work out.
Right.
Was I'm a baby boomer, so I have one perspective, and I'm looking for a millennial or a Gen X, Gen Z, whatever they are. What are you?
I'm Gen Z.
Gen Z.
Gen Z.
So to be able to kind of leapfrog over the last couple of generations and really tie into what my perspective and experience is with all this, and then cut through what's we call the boiled frog educational process. And Christy has witnessed this in schools and college. And despite that, she still maintained conservative outlooks from political point of view, as well as environmental and social. And so, and her dad and I are buddies and members of the same Lions Club, and have the same philosophical approach to raising families and conducting business. And when I found out that Christy had graduated with a degree in entrepreneurship, I asked her dad to make an introduction, and we had breakfast and lunch one day, and it was a done deal. We came to an understanding, and I made her an offer, and she accepted, and that was over a year and a half ago, Tom. And
October 2019.
So
a day or two.
So here we are. And in that time, she has really dived into research and development, structuring a lot of our blogs, and has attended the International Conference on Climate Change with us, and has gone and presented to some local organizations, the Tree Hugging Capitalist PowerPoint, and we also have a Prezi presentation as well. So she walks the walk and talks the talk, as do I. And we have developed over 160 subject matters that will be our blogs going forward for the next several years, which we hope will transform into podcasts, and which we hope will become some sort of a chapter book or booklet series along the lines that a lot of other well-deserved and well-researched organizations like Heritage and Heartland organizations and Cato Institute are doing as well.
Right. Good.
So we hope that we can emulate those, but, from a very conservative point of view, and to, again, bridge the gap between generations so that we'll get more of a youth movement going.
Okay, so we're running down. Yeah, we're running down to about 5 minutes here. So I want to get Christy to.
So I'm going to let Christy do a little chat.
First off, Christy, I got to thank you for being that type of person that's a Z-Genner, if you will, that actually listened to her parents somewhere along the line. And
Yeah.
then you can congratulate your parents for me, if you would, in doing a marvelous job of establishing the principles of life that
Mhm.
you are within that age category where we're experiencing most people have gone radical to the left.
Right.
And to hold to the principles, I will be quiet for the next 2 minutes. So quickly introduce yourself in these next couple of minutes, and then we'll carry over into the next segment with more of our conversation. So go ahead, Christy.
Right. Sounds good. So yeah, like George said, I carried on to his team about a year and a half ago. I am a recent Marist graduate. I graduated in 2020, so unfortunately I didn't have a full commencement. But in that time, I learned so much, and I really got to dive deep into the ideology and with the environment and just with the conservative views as a whole. And throughout my 4 years at school, I watched some of my closest friends totally change. And I grew up with a solid family foundation, which I'm so blessed to say.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, a lot of people my age have fallen short to I call it indoctrination camp of college. And I have to say, I was strong enough to have my own views and stick to it and dive deeper into why I believe the way I believe, not just saying this is right and I'm going to believe it because my parents say so.
Mm-hmm.
That type of thing. I dove into it further and I did my own research, which is important for young kids to do and young students to do, because if we're going to be voting, we need to have informed voters, and uninformed voters lead to what we have now.
Yeah.
So getting back to how I came into this, growing up, my dad and I used to go out and clean up the oceans. We live on the water, and we used to go out early mornings and clean up trash on the beach. And from a young age, I've really, grown to love the earth and want to protect it. And I really enjoy spending time out there with him on the boat. But yes, furthermore, with what George was saying before, we've worked on this whole timeline to go over the past 52 years now since the first Earth Day. And all this ideology and changing of narratives between each decade, it's when you total it all together, it's insane to see. And every 10 years, it changed.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to get more younger people around my age to really come aware to the truths that are taking place and the lies that are being spoken about the environment and about this ideology.
So one of the things that, go ahead, George, real quick.
Yeah,
You got 1 minute.
Just to kind of sum it up, the timeline that Christy has put together and researched, and anybody that's been involved in the environmental on either side is well aware of the 50 plus years of, of all the different attempts to try and persuade generations of the crisis or emergency or warming or whatever it is. But it's the foundation of the tree-hugging capitalist. It's the core that we tie all of our blogs and our writings and research about. And it's where we're going to take it for the next several years from that foundational and fundamental timeline.
Yeah, great. Because one of the things that, I always like to say, on the topic, and you've heard me say this before, it goes from our, God-given responsibilities to take and just that initial out of Genesis, what we're supposed to do on taking care of all things that God created. So there's a mandate there that we naturally have. And then how is it that that has been spoiled by, as you're saying, the ideologies where, I always just come straight out and forward and say that those are the humanistic transitions of what was given to us in a righteous manner to have stewardship. And that was one of the terms that we've used a lot, George. You and I have talked about that over the years, is what is that stewardship? So in this last 30 seconds, I'm going to wrap it and we'll carry on into the next segment. We have some really interesting areas to talk about with the tree-hugging capitalist folks. Now, you have to understand, Sam Adams did understand environment, but he did it from that very biblical perspective of what does it mean to be a steward, not just over the environment, but within the whole political process as well. So come on, folks, just return with us as Sam Adams did now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists did get it right, and I have today as my guests George and Christy, and they're just nothing but a couple of tree-hugging capitalists? What do you mean nothing, Tom? They're great at it. George, wait a minute, folks. Look at if you're watching the video, you can see the smiles on their faces because they know I'm pulling their legs. This is great stuff. And as I mentioned before, I've known George for 20 years now, and Christy over the last year and a half. I've had opportunities to work and know these folks, and that we are driving in this conversation to what it really means about stewardship. And in that, we want to pick back up what we finished off the last segment with when George and Christy were talking about those timelines of ideology shifts, the ideological shift over the last 50 plus years. So I'll leave it to which of you want to jump right back in on the timeline work, because Christy's done some phenomenal stuff. That's at, George, where's your website?
thetreehuggingcapitalist.com.
Mm-hmm. Right.
All spelled out. And so as I had alluded to earlier, Christy has done a lot of research into this, and it was very powerful for her to understand what you and I have experienced for the last 50 years, Tom, which is they just keep changing tack. It's like a sailboat going into the wind.
But hold on, who's they? Who's they? Give me a little bit on.
They is the green movement, the greater green movement, and it involves ideologues. It involves academia. It now involves the media, and unfortunately, it's reached into the government. And through that, they're now reaching out through woke individuals who are now manning positions of responsibility or influence or investment in a lot of major corporations and industries. And this will trickle down or trickle up toward Main Street USA. And what we have basically created, the Tree Hugging Capitalist platform, is to bypass the censorship that exists on YouTube, LinkedIn, not so much, but Twitter and all your Facebook, where they're just banning or filtering or suppressing the facts about the environment. And, it's the old Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin, statement: if you tell a lie long enough times, it eventually becomes accepted as truth.
So with that, Christy, how based on what you were talking about in your educational experience and now looking over that timeline, how is it that you're seeing with what you're doing with George and the Tree Hugging Capitalists is going to take and be able to reach the crossover that George was talking about generationally? What's your perspective on, first, how do you get people to even to believe that Karl Marx was a bad guy, or these ideologies, they sound great, but yet, how is your level of influence going to be able to impact what this whole this effort that you guys are working on?
So a couple things. First, I want to jump back to piggyback off of what George was saying. It's interesting because senior year, it was freshman year of college, I did a final project on global warming. That was the topic that I chose. And at the time, I knew, okay, global warming, I don't really know how I feel about it. I don't think it exists, but I'm just going to do a project on it anyway. So I did a project on both sides of it, but I knew which was right and which was wrong, but I didn't know why. And so 4 years later, fast forward, now I'm diving more into it, and I see that I knew my ideology was correct in how I thought, but I wanted to find out why. And the timeline really opened my eyes to a broader perspective on it. And back to what you said with Karl Marx, with the socialist ideology, and I see friends that believe it. And I almost want to say, like, give me one example of where it works. You cannot find one example as to where socialism has worked in the past. So it's important for us to line that up for them to really show them that it will never work. It's just empty promises. It all sounds great on paper, but in reality, it will never work. Nobody will be happy. They want you to own nothing and be happy. So back to the timeline, I can just run through the decades really quick if you allow me to do that.
Sure. Yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that? Because then, what we'll be able to do is that those that listen to the program will be able to have a snapshot. And let's do it that way. Do it as a snapshot. And
Sure. Okay. So going back to the first Earth Day in 1970, we see the ideology that we're going to be starving to death. We're going to have a 4-degree cooler Earth by 1990. It's going to be the end of civilization in 15 to 30 years. We're not going to have any more oil left. And they're talking about the new ice age coming. So once the 1980s hit, the narrative now shifts to a warming climate rather than a cooling climate. Global warming was first introduced in this decade as well, giving us a 10-year window before warming will go beyond human control. We're going to experience 3-foot rising sea levels. There's going to be flooding, this and that, and then mass displacement of people. So as you know, these predictions have not come to pass because we're now in 2022.
yes.
Now the 1990s come, and the first Earth Summit was held in 1992, forming a framework for economies to run more sustainably. And this is when we first see the recycling efforts, plastic versus paper bags, more sustainability efforts between companies across the world. And then once we get to the 2000s, global warming then finally takes off. And they predict that we'll have milder winters, more fires and tornadoes. This is when we see Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth come out. Mm-hmm. And he gave us a decade to save the planet,
right.
Which we've made it past a decade now. Yeah. They're also talking about the polar bears at this point and how they're going to go extinct, and there's going to be no more Arctic ice. We're going to have a food shortage in 10 years. And now, as you see, they're trying to push that through with what's currently going on in the world. Yes. With Ukraine and production supply and everything along those lines.
They're doing a self-fulfilling prophecy right now on the food supply and everything. But right.
Yep. And then we move into the 2010s, and now the narrative shifts to climate change. So we went from the new ice age to a warming climate, global warming, and now we're into climate change to kind of bundle everything up into that umbrella term where you can kind of say that anything will be contributing to the Earth's climate changing, essentially.
Sure.
So we also hear about coral reefs at this time, that the bleaching that's taking place, they're all dying off. The waters are getting warmer. They're saying that we're going to have more intense natural disasters. And then AOC, we hear her claim that we will have 12 years to save the Earth.
Right.
And this is when we first hear of the Green New Deal as well. So now the present day, we're at a climate crisis now. It's climate change, now it's a climate crisis. And we have such a finite amount of time to take action. And now there's climate clocks in major cities. In New York, there's a climate clock. We have a certain amount of time. I think it's 7 years now, or less than that, to save the Earth, essentially. So it's just a bunch of, pushback predictions, and the timeline always gets moved back. As you notice throughout the decades, it's pretty clear to see that even Al Gore mispredicted things, and Prince Charles mispredicted things, and he said we have 500 days to live. I think it was 2008, I believe, and we've made it past that. So
when we're looking at all of this, and you're having the communications with different people, no matter, generationally, we cross through that whole spectrum and we try to look at that. We're seeing that, from your perspective with the tree-hugging capitalists, as I understand it, is to initially touch into that business community where they're being so heavily influenced by regulations that, what you do at a peer level, you have a personal knowledge base. But now what you're doing in the next 5 minutes between you and George, or I'm going to give you 4 because I'll take the last minute. But what you're doing now is trying to get into those businesses of impact again, trying to reach into that because so many businesses are having these regulations foisted on them. Can you talk about that as we close out this segment? And then we'll pick it up in the last segment on, what the solutions are and what you're trying to bring. So, gosh, how do you talk to businesses and people that have all of this being shoved down their throats one way or another?
Yeah, so Christy leads off with that foundation of the timeline, which is really important.
Yep.
Because if an individual or a business understands the plethora and linear descent of the lies and the timelines and their objectives, you really can call out the platform for what it is, which is control. Mm-hmm. And it's through language. They control the language. They control the dialogue, if I wouldn't even call it a dialogue, but a monologue. And they have a very complicit media, government, and, Politburo aspect of it, driven by academia mostly, in the ideological field of the new religion of saving the planet or Mother Earth. And we always draw, after our timeline, we draw the attention to the individuals or the organizations to 2 things. George Carlin did a brilliant Save the Whales, Save the Snails, his monologue on the planet, which is about 7 minutes. Right. And the other is a couple of years ago, Michael Moore produced a film called The Planet Human, which is a behind-the-scenes, under-the-hood look at the solar and wind energy, the lobbies that are involved in it, and the political and non-government organizational push and drives that are benefiting all those organizations at the expense of the American public and the consumer and of the environment, quite frankly. They're destroying hilltops, they're destroying forests and lands to plant hundreds and thousands of acres of, weather-dependent renewable energy sources that are totally dependent on backup fossil fuel and nuclear power to keep them up and running. And all they've done is increase the expenses of our utilities.
I call them hill lice.
Yeah, through mandates and through government regulations and taxes and surcharges and investment tax credits, etc. And they're benefiting only a select few.
Okay, George.
Yeah.
Right there. You're talking about follow the money.
Yes.
Because it really, when it comes down to it, and I may capitalize this last minute and a half, and we'll pick up with it in the next segment. It really comes down to this whole movement is about who is going to benefit on the financial side of it when we start taking and moving into those special interests. And I think, isn't that something that you're really trying to bring back out within the context of businesses? Look at how do they resist when they know who is behind all of these efforts, and they're not really going to benefit from any of it. Is that something that you're trying to communicate?
Yeah, no, and I mean, Christy has done a lot of investigation into a lot of the NGOs, and why don't you just speak to them about,
30 seconds, and then we'll pick it up in the next. Go ahead.
Okay.
Quickly. So some of these big NGOs, all of the funding that they get, like the Sierra Nevada Club, the conservatory, is it the conservatory?
Yeah,
the Nature Conservatory.
Right,
and
World Wildlife
Fund. they get millions and millions of dollars in funds from donors, and it's not going to the cause that they say it's going to.
Exactly.
Which is disappointing.
Yeah. And so with that, what we're going to do is we look at it from a historical perspective as well. And that's what the Anti-Federalists predicted, was that whole idea that we would have designing men of different means taking and trying to then be the control mechanisms and develop those oligarchies over we the people. So come on back for the third segment when we really wrap it up deep. And welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists had such a historical perspective that we're sitting here and talking with George and Christy about the tree-hugging capitalist. And as we finished off that last segment, what we have found is that, wow, what does it say in Scripture? Nothing new under the sun. And that the oligarchy, the money drivers, the power mongers are no different from when this nation was founded until what we're hearing and we're going to continue to talk about at SamuelAdamsReturns.net is where you can get that second segment for all you folks that are out there in the other listening markets that are only getting the short version of this program. So with that, we're going to pick back up with Christy and George talking about that timeline, that transition. But wait a minute. Christy, you were talking about all these organizations that are getting all this funding, and I don't see any of it going into our pockets. So when we look at even the conservative organizations, they're not getting the level of funding that the other organizations that are pressing this ideology are getting. And what's your thought process on that?
Well, I think this ideology has been spread out so far with these regulations and mandates through the government that these big organizations, these big NGOs are being funded by larger companies. Mm-hmm. And these larger companies are doing the right thing by donating millions of dollars to these, we'll say, environmentalist agencies that say that they're going to do well for the environment. Well, in reality, they're using lawfare to push through these new regulations and laws to affect.
You called that what? What did you, lawfare?
Lawfare, yep. When they hire lawyers to go into court and fight against environmentalist issues, mm-hmm. and they get their way by getting backed by all these bigger companies, and they have the money to do so.
Whether it's to delay a permit or stall a pipeline or mm-hmm. protect a geographic piece of earth by having some sort of a spotted turtle with feathers habitat, to logging, that may disrupt nesting. It's ironic that the windmills are killing hundreds of endangered species,
Yep.
Across the board and across the country, and nobody makes a peep. But if you wanted to put in a oil platform or a natural gas drill somewhere, you have to go jumping through hoops to get it done. And essentially what the Biden administration has done recently is made the amounts of, even though they say they're opening up for oil and gas, they've made they've provided very few areas that they know probably aren't going to work available. They've shut down most of it. They've created such an environmental red tape bureaucracy about getting anything done that it's really just all, washing
right.
of their hands to say, hey, we're doing our part to help the economy. And meanwhile, they want us to, buy oil from, not such great places like Venezuela,
right.
Russia, Iraq, Iran, etc., where we're now going back to importing instead of producing on our own.
So what I want to do is stop you on that just for a second, George, because I'm hanging on that word, that new word that Christy just brought up there about lawfare being warfare, but with law, that's not a new term.
No, it's been around.
It goes back all the way to 1850-ish with Bastiat. So if you read Bastiat the Law, it's using all of these mechanisms, again, nothing new. Yeah. And yet, I really appreciate the way that you were able to put that in there into a modern phraseology for people to take that time and say, wait a minute, what is she talking about? And ask that question as I did, and then be able to take it through that explanation. So once again...
and so it's sort of smoke and mirrors and deception, but the World Wildlife Foundation, Sierra Club, Natural Resource Defense Council, they're all getting tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of them have over $1 billion in assets to really take that money from people that think they're saving the polar bears and, wildlife around the world. And it's being plowed into legal firms that are going there that are disrupting oil, fracking, pipelines, transportation, and other energy innovations to just drive it toward two areas that are going to cripple and disrupt our energy supply. And at the end of the day, the United States is far and above beyond any world economy because of our ability to have all the natural resources and produce natural, cheap, efficient energy.
Yeah. So with
and if
that,
you look at
So look at
China, but it just as China as their resources of coal. They're putting up a coal power plant one a week throughout China, and they're powering it unfiltered, and they're contributing to the pollution in the world. And if you want to draw CO2 attention to it, their contribution is greater than anybody else, and India is a close second.
So real quick, let's take that to that next push on that, where we're kind of highlighted when it comes down to what China's doing and all the others are doing, because we're down to our last 7 minutes. I know it's always fun when things go quick, but now it's impacting our food supply. It's impacting our means of transporting. We're seeing the Postal Service saying they're going to slow things down because of the environment. We know that as what lit my hair on fire was Union Pacific saying they're slowing down fertilizer going to the farmers, as well as then taking and transporting feed. And I know that the rail system is a mess anyway, but diesel engines on trains are extremely efficient, but yet our food supply, and you have those that are out there promoting the idea that no, as we kind of talked about briefly, you're not going to eat meat anymore. You're going to go on to all these other substances. So what are we looking at from that idea then of stewardship and relationship? Once again, these hardcore ideologies. But here's the real question. Why isn't it on the funding side? I'm sorry, I flipped back to that. Is Heritage and the other folks up in Chicago, why aren't they getting the funding? Yeah, I mean, theirs is all private donations, almost all individuals. And just to put it in perspective, the Sierra Club is probably $100 million or more in annual funding. I think the Heartland is somewhere between $4 and $7 million. So a staff of 40 or 50 putting out tremendous, information and real data-driven, fact-driven information versus ideologues that are going around. They probably have 600 lawyers within their organization to go around doing all this disruptive, whether it's Clean Energy Act or environmental policies, land use, water, you name it, they're driving all of this. And for the purpose of disrupting, basically, the economic engine of the U.S. And to your point, Tom, about the rail systems, because we don't have the pipelines to take the gas and the oil to the refineries,
they have to, the rail systems are
Picking it up.
being utilized to get that from point A to point B. The pipeline isn't stopping the oil from getting to the refineries. It's just being rerouted through a more expensive, less safe, and not as environmentally friendly means of transportation, which in turn the agriculture and the meat businesses are competing with the oil for the use of those tracks, which are limited.
Sure.
And costs.
So let's take it. I'm going to cut you off because we're down to that last 5 minutes here.
Yeah.
Is that let's look at it from the two last things that I wanted to touch bases with you on, is that unequivocally this whole thing is a religion in what we have going on as far as the whole, because I mean, when somebody from even a Buddhist or whatever takes and lights themselves here in America, on fire at the Supreme Court steps, that's really showing their dedication in such a manner. And then globally, they start calling him a martyr for what he was doing. So just wanted to establish that. But let's finish it with your comment on that, but finish it with what are you guys doing next? And let's just recap what you were talking about on your next steps and your target market. Okay?
Yeah. No. So the real essential here is that the environmental movement is a religion. They worship the earth beyond and above man. So earth is more important than man. And from our Judeo-Christian background, and Christy and I talk about this often, and to make sure that we stay rooted there and that whoever we're speaking to understands it, that God provided us the earth, that we are tasked with being responsible for its maintenance, its upkeep, and to preserve it for future generations. And we've been bad at it historically, especially in the last century or two, where everything was discarded on the roadside. We polluted our rivers, oceans, and lakes. We polluted our air, but we've made major steps into changing that.
Yeah.
And it really comes down to how we, as good human beings and taking care of fellow man, preserve the earth, protect the earth, and follow the means and the needs necessary to serve our fellow man. So when people start talking about carbon dioxide as being a toxic part of the environment, they have no idea about basic chemistry or biology,
right,
and how important it is to the plant cycle. And if anybody has been in a greenhouse, they'll find out that the parts per million of CO2 is 2 or 3 times what we have in our atmosphere. And so you always ask, well, what is the ideal amount of CO2 you should have? What is the ideal temperature the earth should be at? Nobody really has an answer.
Right.
They sure can complain about it, and they're being brainwashed into discussing it. But the reality is that these are important things, and the earth has experienced a lot higher temperatures and a lot more CO2 over its history.
Right.
So the fact, is that we have to draw that out.
Okay, so we're down to the last minute and a half, George. So you're tree hugging capitalist, and that's what treehuggingcapitalist.com. And
yes.
So what you guys are going to do is you're starting to move into podcasts and
we're going to eventually, we're doing blogs, and we're posting weekly. When we've accumulated a few more, we're going to start podcasting based on those. But our real drive, Tom, is that Christy and I are meeting at smaller organizations, chambers of commerce, school boards, and school PTAs, and student organizations, trade associations that need to understand what the government, the federal government, and state and local right now following suit are regulating us into oblivion and going to take over our economy if we don't stop. The form of having access to all different types of energy and inexpensive energy are being threatened, and that's where we're trying to drive this.
Okay.
And it's all through the environmental movement.
Okay, great. It's been a delight having you, George, and Christy on the program. As I always try to do is give that last moment that there are those mirrors in history. They may have looked different from all the terminology, but there's always been the oligarchies. And ladies and gentlemen, come on back next week when Samuel Adams returns. And you know what? Those anti-federalists, they pretty well had it pegged. So check that out. Go get a chance to read Bastiat and see the program at SamuelAdamsReturns.net.